So we continue on with this process, with this conversation or the series of conversations in the form of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. What we're going to do today is talk about some very particular terms. And the grounding for these terms is what we'll call the philosophy of science, or these terms describe the philosophy of science. Now, instead of making this philosophy for the sake of philosophy or discussion for the sake of it, my aim is going to be to invoke particular examples that will relate to osteopathy as a profession and more broadly to hands-on professions. Right. So I was going to say hands-on professions as a profession, but that's clearly redundant and sounds silly. And now I said it, so there it is. Anyways, so the three large terms are going to be epistemology, ontology, and axiology. Realistically, as far as the order is concerned, some would argue it should be ontology first, epistemology next, then axiology, and I'll explain why. Under ontology, we'll talk about essentially materialists versus idealists, or there's other ways to say that, but those that believe that physical objects are the most real versus those that believe that ideas are the most real. As far as epistemology, we'll generally talk about positivism versus constructivism as ends of a spectrum. And then with axiology, it's a little bit more straightforward because it means a relatively clear thing. And it is evidenced in the application of ontology and epistemology. Ontology leads to an epistemology, and then axiology is displayed by the ontology chosen or the ontology preference and the epistemology preference. And what you'll actually see a lot of times, and I'll maybe point to this, well, hopefully I'll point to this, and that there are times when claims will be made that will look like one of these things, but it will really be the other. So it can get a little dicey trying to figure it out if you don't know what you're looking at. Anyways, aside from the preamble, first we'll talk about ontology. So ontology is a study of reality, or the philosophy of reality. You could say it that way. So it's how reality is viewed, might be a reasonable way to say it. It's not a perfect way to say it, but I think it's a reasonable way to say it. So you essentially have a spectrum. You have those that believe that ideas are the most real, as I already noted. You could call them idealists. And then you could have those that believe that objects are the most real, and you could call those materialists. So if you, the historical example here that we know of, and there were probably people before these two individuals that we'll use as examples of this spectrum, but we don't necessarily have the record that many of us can broadly access to understand that it would have happened before these people. But if I was to predict something, it happened before these people. So on the idealist side, you have Plato or Platonists, right? So Plato essentially, very, very broad strokes, would suggest that material objects were not the ideal. They were just poor facsimiles of this kind of what many people call a Platonic ideal. So this ideal object. So say you're talking about osteopathy and you're talking about a treatment table. The treatment table is but a poor facsimile of what a real treatment table is. And the real treatment table is in the world of the idea, right? So the idea is the real thing. And from that, through the hands of the human and the interpretation of the human, springs this poor facsimile of the real table, right? Whereas Aristotle, who was Plato's student, would hold that, maybe there's some value there to the Platonic ideal, that ideas are real things because they will guide and drive production of material objects or the shaping of the material world. But Plato would also say that the material world is real and it bears observing and investigation is probably a reasonable way to put it. So tables are not all the same, and there's reasons that tables aren't all the same. Let's go look at how tables are similar, how tables are different, right? Maybe talk to the people that produce the tables, And what you are likely to identify is that the the people vary, but their aim is the same, and the variance is notable in the variation in the table. So something like that. But to maybe pull back to both of those concepts, if you believe that ideas are the most real, then essentially reality lives in the head of the individual. Whereas if you believe that objects are the most real, or the material world is the most real, then you tend to believe that there is a singular reality that can be identified through appropriate experimentation, right? So that this leads to how I'm going to describe epistemology in a moment. But on a basic level, if you believe ideas are the most real, then reality is in the head of the individual. If you believe objects are the most real, then reality is shared between individuals, is probably the most succinct way I'm going to be able to put that at the moment. Now we shift over to epistemology, which is a theory of knowledge. I tend to call it a theory of knowledge creation, right? And there are varying reasons for that, because there's a process to knowledge. It doesn't just spring up from nowhere. There's steps to get there. So the questions generally asked with respect to epistemology are what can be known, how can it be known, and who can it be known by? And this is where ontology tends to lead epistemology, because if you believe that ideas are or reality is in the head of the individual, then you are likely to be what's called a constructivist. You believe that truth or knowledge is dependent on the individual, the environment of observation, the previous experience of the individual, right? So reality is individual. There is little to no crossover between the realities of individuals. Whereas if you're on the other end of the spectrum, that I'm proposing, and some people may disagree with this, but you would be called what's called a positivist. So if you believe the materials are the most real, you believe that reality is shared, then you would believe that there is a singular reality that can be identified through appropriate experimentation. The acknowledgement in that statement is that humans are variable. Humans will cause flaws in the process of knowledge generation. So you want to attempt to decontextualize the generation of knowledge as much as you can. So you want to minimize the presence or impact of an individual on the process of knowledge creation, right? So if we talk about osteopathy with respect to this spectrum, if you believe that ideas are the most real and that reality is in the head of the individual, then you are much more likely as a practitioner to pay attention to subjective factors, the experience of the patient, the emotion of the patient. Does the patient think it's better? Does the patient not think it's better? Does the patient think it's worse in relation, whatever they're reporting in relation to your intervention? So you are likely to not appreciate or be concerned with objective measures or measures that are standardized and agreed upon between individuals. If you are a positivist, you are more likely to, as an osteopathic practitioner, you are much more likely to be concerned about what would be called objective measures, or in another way, measures that are agreed upon between individuals and standardized. So something moved 10 degrees, now it moves 12 degrees. Something moved 12 degrees, now it moves 20 degrees, whatever it happens to be. Or something moved equally to its counterpart on the other side of the body, or unequally. So it moved unequally to start, now it moves equally, right? So if you're a positivist and an osteopathic practitioner, you're more likely to be concerned with the change in a standardized or agreed upon measurement. Whereas if you're a constructivist, you're a little bit more likely to be concerned about the experience of the patient, the feelings of the patient, right? So you will see this clash. A common refrain that some may report or hear is that, well, the patient liked it, the patient noted something positive, the patient appreciated it. And then the question is, well, did they move any better? And the answer being no, then you can see the dichotomy there. Whereas somebody will say it moved better, but the patient felt the same. That is the kind of the dichotomy between these ends of the epistemological spectrum in the individual reality versus the shared reality, or the constructivist reality versus the positivist reality. What I would say is that they are concurrent or co-occurring phenomenon. Your individual reality is always running in concert with the shared reality. You can pay more attention to one, you can pay more attention to the other, you can put more value on one, put more value on the other, but they're happening at the same time. And they're very difficult to piece apart unless you put a frame up and you look in a very particular way. Now, you can put a frame up to look at subjective experiences. You can put a frame up to look at objective experiences or objective measures. Those are both possibilities. You can do things where you're attempting to consider both and see if they cross over well, right? So the patient felt good but didn't move any better. The patient felt bad and moved much better, right? So they don't always, these measurements may not always go hand in hand in the same direction. Or you can have the patient felt no different and they moved no different. The patient felt worse and they moved worse. The patient felt better and they moved better. These are all possibilities, but you need to be willing to accept both ends of the epistemological spectrum to figure that out, right? So patient report and objective measures don't always match, and sometimes they do. They don't always match in a good direction. They don't always match in a bad direction. Sometimes they match in a bad direction. Sometimes they match in a good direction. These are all possibilities, but you have to be willing to engage with both ends of this proposed spectrum to figure that out, right? Now, something that I want to touch back on now that I've talked about epistemologies, I want to touch back on the term ontology, not in its philosophical sense, but in its philosophy of science sense. Now, how would I differentiate those? Well, with respect to the scientific method, an ontology is really much more a classification system because it's the study of reality. To study reality, you need a way to view it. So you have to make a choice. If you are comparing two things that you know are different, so let's just say you're comparing a car a bicycle and a motorcycle. Okay, because there's a lot of crossover here. So you're comparing a car and a motorcycle. So if your category is how many wheels does this thing have, the answer is going to be 2 for both of them. So that's a category in which each thing is described of its own merit. When you describe a motorcycle and a bicycle based on how many wheels, they're the same. How many tires? 2, the same. How many rubber tires? 2, the same. Right? Depending on the bicycle, I think there's some different materials now for tires, but let's just assume that we're talking about a bicycle with rubber tires. Do they have brakes? Right? Yes. Right now, do they both have disc brakes, front and rear? We can actually now say on most motorcycles and some bicycles, they'd have disc brakes, front and rear, so they could be exactly the same again. So we've got all these categories we've gone through where they're exactly the same. Now, the category of differentiation will be what propels these things. In the case of a motorcycle, in most cases, it's going to be an internal combustion engine of some description. Whereas with a bicycle, in most cases, it's going to be a human. So it's going to be people powered or human powered. Now, there are electrical bikes, and there's electrical motorcycles. So again, interestingly enough, a motorcycle and a bicycle could be very similar depending on the particular ones you're comparing within that category. But broadly speaking, the differentiating category for a motorcycle and a bicycle is going to be how are they propelled. And one is propelled by the power of the person riding, whereas one is propelled by an internal combustion engine and not the person riding. So what you see is we can have a bunch of categories, which are going to be lenses through which to describe an object in its own right, to then compare against another object which is described in the same category in its own right. And then they look exactly the same until we get to this particular category which differentiates them. So the building of the set of categories to describe things for the sake of comparison is an ontology. It's a classification system that is built in order to describe each thing in its own right, then to be able to compare them to note where they're the same and where they're different. So it is still the study of reality within the scientific method. However, what it is a little bit more rigid because you're generating categories to describe the reality of each object that you're looking at and comparing. Now, we can add a third object in there, but we're not going to do that because I think the point is illustrated. So we've got ontology in the philosophical sense as the study of reality. You've got the split between those that believe that ideas are the most real, and then those that believe that material is the most real or objects are the most real. So individual reality versus shared reality. We have epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge or theory of knowledge creation. You have constructivists that tend to believe that truth or knowledge is dependent on the individual, the environment of observation, and previous experience of the individual, whereas positivists on the other end of the spectrum believe that there is an individual a singular reality, which can also be termed a shared reality, which can be identified with appropriate experimentation. It's not always an obvious thing. Sometimes the obvious things are misleading, right? So there's a lot of things that are stable and observable that are very counterintuitive. And in being stable and observable, we can call them factual or true. Now, you can argue about the particular fact or the particular truth that we would put into this category, but what you can see is that they are stable and they're observable amongst many people and they can be agreed upon. Therefore, we can say that that's a form of shared reality, and we happen to be describing it with particular phonemes or particular sounds. Now, you give me a different language and the sounds would be different, but the meaning would be the same. So something along those lines. Anyways, the term, and then as I noted with respect to osteopathy, as far as an epistemology is concerned, if you believe in individual reality, then the subjective measures are more likely your jam. If you believe in objective measures or agreed upon measures, standardized measures, then the shared reality is probably a little bit more your jam, and the objective measures are probably more your thing. As far as the term axiology, axiology is essentially the study of values within science. It is the value or value judgments of the researcher, or in the case of osteopathy, it would be the values of the observer or the practitioner. And that would be noted in the things that the individual practitioner happens to be paying attention to. If the practitioner is paying attention more to the patient's feelings and excluding the objective measures or the shared agreed upon measures, then their value is the subjective experience. Whereas if somebody is looking more at the objective experience or the objective observable stuff, such as changes in motion capacity or motion quality, then their value is more that objective stuff. So you can see the value decisions or the value judgments based on what people pay attention to. You will see some practitioners who will, depending on the presentation of the patient, shift more to the subjective, shift more to the objective, maybe consider both. As a particular practitioner myself, I tend to take in the information about the subjective experience and the objective experience and note to the patient that they won't always match. So they may move quite a bit better when I'm done treating them and feel exactly the same, right? So that is entirely possible. I say that they don't always line up. That is something that I note. So this isn't necessarily tooting my own horn. It's just to note that I do happen to make the value judgment that subjective and objective co-occur. They're at the same time. You can focus more on one, you can focus more on the other, depending on the particular needs of the situation. But I tend to see them as co-occurring. I do see an over-reliance on the subjective stuff, meaning that the objective stuff is neglected. And the same would be true the other way. So again, my tendency is to pay attention to both. But as far as my work is concerned, the things that I actually do, what I see as much more valuable is the agreed upon standardized measures. Does it move better in terms of quantity or quality? That's what I focus more on as a practitioner. But as maybe in a total sense, the subjective does have to be acknowledged and discussed, right? So it's always included. So we've got the three terms, ontology, epistemology, and axiology. We've discussed them as far as meaning is concerned. We've given a few examples within the osteopathic profession, maybe as to how this would look and which practitioner might be more of one thing and less of the other, so on and so forth. So just as a quick recap, and the point of this, so before I do the quick recap, the point of having this discussion is to lay the foundation for further discussions so that when I talk about epistemology, when I talk about ontology, when I talk about axiology, when I show you what is available with respect to osteopathic research, I can show you where weight is put more on the individual reality or more weight is put on the shared reality. And, the arguments in favor of and against either side What I would generally state before doing the quick recap is that in a healthcare sense, right? So in a sense of doing the job that you're most capable of doing, the objective measures are probably of high value. You are still dealing with a human being, so the subjective measures also have high value, but they're less likely to have a net positive outcome within your scope of practice, whatever your scope of practice may be, when compared to the objective measures. So the objective measures are much more likely to give the patient the net positive outcome. So if your objective measures are changes in motion quantity or quality, if your objective measures are, reduction in heart rate, reduction in respiratory rate, increase in those things. If your, objective measure is decrease in sweating or increase in sweating, if you're a personal trainer, if you're a physician, increase in vitamin B12 present on blood assay, whatever it is, your objective measures are likely to be the thing that you're going to have the most net benefit for the patient if you pay attention to those. Do not ignore the subjective measures on account of the fact that they have value for the patient internally. So their individual reality, their subjective measures do matter. But that's probably not the place you're going to have a net positive benefit for a patient if you are a hands-on practitioner, if you're a massage therapist, or physiotherapist, if you're a chiropractor, if you're an osteopathic practitioner, you're going to have a net benefit on the objective measures. You may have a positive impact on the subjective measures. The easiest thing to note is that as long as you're not a total bastard or a total jerk and have absolutely no interpersonal connection with your patient, the subjective side will probably be taken care of with relative ease. You don't have to do a lot to pay attention to it necessarily. You can if you choose to, but if you're a hands-on practitioner, you're not a psychological practitioner, so you're not likely to win in the psychological or the emotional realm. You're not likely to bring your patient a win there because of your skill set and your scope. You should acknowledge it. You should pay attention to it, but you're probably not going to win there. You're going to win on the quantity and quality of movement changing. The degree to which quantity and quality of movement relate appropriately to subjective report is variable. It's not always the same. So as I noted, you can make the patient move better and they can feel worse. You can make the patient move better and they feel the same. You can make the patient move better and they feel better. There's a range of outcomes. So that's actually a fairly reliable phenomenon. So I've talked about reliability being a consistent range of outcomes, as well as having a discriminatory element in that you're able to identify what ideal motion is and what motion is present, whether it is ideal or not. So you can tell if it is what it's supposed to be or it's not what it's supposed to be. So the term discrimination here is not necessarily a negative term. It's a term that allows you to know whether or not you should do something. So is the movement what it should be? If the answer is yes, then you leave it alone. If the answer is no, then you can do something with it. And certain methodologies are indicated. So that discrimination is actually a net positive because you know what the heck you should be doing and where you should be doing it. So if you focus as a hands-on practitioner on the subjective experience of the patient, that's probably not where you're going to win. Now, your patient may feel like you won, but that's not where your skill set lies. I would argue strongly that your net positive benefit to a patient is going to be on objective agreed upon measures. So that's my argument, but it still contains that you should pay attention to the subjective side. And the easiest way to do that is just not be a jerk, right? Don't ignore your patient's subjective reports. Don't downplay them, but don't upplay them because you don't necessarily have the skill set of being a practitioner within the psychological emotional realm. So I've noted that already, and so it's a little bit redundant. But as a quick recap of the point of the terms in this discussion, ontology is a study of reality. Philosophically speaking, you're going to have the bifurcation of those that believe in the individual reality or that ideas are the most real thing. So the reality is in the individual. Then you have those who believe in a shared reality, or materialists. They believe that objects or shared things are the most real. You have epistemology, which is a study of knowledge, or sorry, rather a theory of knowledge or a theory of knowledge creation. You have the constructivists who believe that knowledge or truth is dependent on the individual environment of observation and previous experience of the individual. Then you have the positivists on the other end of the spectrum. There's things in between, but they matter a little bit less for the point of the discussion. The positivists believe that there is a singular reality that can be identified with appropriate experimental methods. So it's not always immediately observable or easy to figure out, which is why you have to decontextualize knowledge. You should be taking the impact of people or the observer out as much as you can. It's not entirely possible because we are the observers, but you do your best to decontextualize knowledge. Then you have axiology, which is the value or value judgments, in this case of the practitioner. So do they pay more attention to the subjective side? Do they pay more attention to the objective side? That essentially intones their values. It's a little bit more of an implicit thing, but they do make choices. All right, so all of that to say that these are ways of looking at the osteopathic profession, especially with respect to the realm of research. So when I look at research going forwards in subsequent podcasts, I'll note these terms. I'll obviously explain them again if you haven't listened to this one. And if you have listened to this one, it's going to be redundant. So, just be ready for that. We're going to use these terms to say this is slightly more of a constructivist type paper, or this is more of a positivist type paper, right? And I'll explain why as we go forward. But the point of this is to ground that discussion or set the stage for that discussion. So as usual, hopefully you got something from that, and I'll talk to you soon.